allegiance to Jesus Christ. Amen. I pledge allegiance to the Bible. Amen. You may be seated. Last week we started the new section in the book of Zechariah, which was chapter 9. The stage setting of chapter 9 is that God is now addressing that group of Israelites who have chosen not to take advantage of the favor God has bestowed upon His people, and have chosen simply to remain in exile in Babylon. So we learn from chapter 9 that God directly confronted these people in Babylon. We will find this in verses 11 and 12. As for you, because of the blood of my covenant with you, I will free your prisoners from the waterless pit. Return to your fortress, you prisoners of hope. Even now I announce that I will restore twice as much to you. You see, these verses reveals God's plan for His people. All the prosperity that He had in mind for them centered on them returning to the land of promise. The point that needs to be understood here is that all Israelites should return to Israel because God was about to send His king to them. And we see that in verse 9 of chapter 9 of last week's sermon. Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Therefore, since the king is coming to Israel, since God is promising to take care of all the surrounding enemies, of course, we found that in the last sermon, they were all defeated by Alexander the Great. And since all of God's blessings which He has promised is for Israel and not Babylon, then they need to abandon their lives in Babylon. And they need to go back with eyes of faith to Israel, to the land of promise. They need to take hold of the life that God had promised to them. This morning we are going to learn 3 things that can only come from God. From our text, Zechariah chapter 10, verses 1 through 12. So if you brought your Bible with you, or you can look at the screen for the references, okay? 3 things that can only come from God, and that's the theme of my sermon today. It can only come from God. So, the number one thing, the first thing that can only come from God, according to our text today, is blessing. Blessing can only come from God. We will find this in verses 1 and 2. Look at verse 1. Ask the Lord for rain in the springtime. It is the Lord who sends the thunderstorms. He gives showers of rain to all people and plants of the field to everyone. This chapter begins with an invitation from God. Ask the Lord for rain in the springtime. You know, ancient Israel had no irrigation system like what they have now. You know, when I was taking agriculture in the Philippines, we learned about the advancement of agriculture in Israel, especially their irrigation system. But during those times in Israel, they only relied on rain to water their crops. So in a time of drought, nothing grew. So Israel relied on both the winter rains and the spring rains. And we will find this in Hosea. Hosea mentioned about this rains that comes to Israel. Let's look at Hosea chapter 6, verse 3. Let us acknowledge the Lord. Let us press on to acknowledge Him. As surely as the sun rises, He will appear. He will come to us like the winter rains, like the spring rains that water the earth. The winter rains and the spring rains were both a picture of God's blessings on His people, because both were necessary for the success of their crop. God here invites His people to turn to Him and ask Him for the spring rain, for what they needed. He is their provider. Amen? He is our provider as well. And he goes on to say here, it is the Lord who sends the thunderstorms. He gives showers of rain to all people and plants of the field to everyone. So the Lord challenged His people, saying, be bold to come to me and ask me, and I will answer your prayer. I will provide what I alone can provide. The reason God needed to urge His people to do this was because they had not been turning to Him as they should. And as a result, the rains had not been given. In the Old Testament, the withholding of rain was a sign of God's displeasure. We will find this in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 11, verses 13 through 17. Look at what God says here. So if you faithfully obey the commands I am giving you today, to love the Lord your God, and to serve Him with all your heart and with all your soul, then I will send rain on your land in its season, both autumn and spring rains, so that you may gather in your grain, new wine, and olive oil. I will provide grass in the fields for your cattle, and you will eat and be satisfied. Be careful, or you will be enticed to turn away and worship other gods and bow down to them. Then the Lord's anger will burn against you, and He will shut up the heavens so that it will not rain, and the ground will yield no produce, and you will soon perish from the good land the Lord is giving you. In the past, they had not looked to God. They had turned instead to the false gods and idols. Look at what the verse 2 says in here. The idols speak deceitfully. Diviners see visions that lie. They tell dreams that are false. They give comfort in vain. Therefore the people wander like sheep, oppressed or lack of a shepherd. You know, it reminds me of what Jeremiah prayed to God during his time about this, that the people of God did not turn to Him. Instead, they turned to idols and diviners. Look at what Jeremiah prayed here in Jeremiah chapter 14, verse 22. Do any of the worthless idols to the nations bring rain? Do the skies themselves send down showers? No, it is you, Lord our God. Therefore our hope is in you, for you are the one who does all this. Therefore God is trying to persuade his people to turn to him again and ask him, why? Because they've been turning to idols and diviners, as we see it in verse 2. You know, the people in those times typically placed their confidence for the provision of life in idols. And here we have the word teraphim for the word idols. They are household gods. And of course, they also put their place, they place their confidence on diviners to tell them about their future. You know, diviners, these are people supposedly able to predict the future. You know, the point of divination, of course, was that if one knew the future, he could plan accordingly, avoiding disaster and taking advantage of opportunity. You know, this is still what many people believe and practice in our world today. They go to fortune tellers. They read their horoscope. Do you do that? Do you read horoscope? Huh? What's your zodiac sign? And it tells you your future, right? But of course, this includes people who are smart enough to know by now that no one can reliably predict the future of stock market or the future of the weather, or who's going to win in the Super Bowl. Huh? But so anxious are people for success, so helpless do they feel before the uncertainties of life, that they invest hope in these household gods and diviners. And here's another thing. They refuse to be discouraged by repeated failure. Look at what the text says here. They give comfort in vain. That means these diviners or this horoscope that you are reading, the comfort they give is worth nothing. And that is exactly what you're going to get from idols and diviners. Nothing. Nada. Zero. You will remember that divination was as strictly forbidden in the law of God as was worship of idols. Israel's trust was to be in the Lord and in the Lord only and in His Word. And that was all they need to know. We cannot know the future. And so we are not required to attempt to find it out, which is a good thing. Because you know what? We couldn't, even if we tried. Okay? So don't even try. But here's the good thing though. The Lord gave us a glimpse of what the future looked like in the book of Revelation. So you want to see the future? Huh? You want to know what will happen someday? You need to read the Word of God. You need to read your Bible. Read the book of Revelation. There you will have a glimpse of what future would look like. And who wins in the end. And look at the rest of verse 2. Therefore the people wander like sheep, oppressed for lack of a shepherd. Now what is it saying here? Therefore the people wander like sheep. No direction. They were oppressed. No deliverance. And for lack of a shepherd. No good shepherd. Remember what Jesus said in John chapter 10? He said, I am the good shepherd. So let me tell you this, I'm not your pastor. Your pastor is the Lord Jesus Christ. He is our shepherd. And a good one. Amen? Amen. So the message here is pretty clear. Look at the next slide. Don't listen to people who offer what they cannot produce. Seek the only one who can actually deliver. Only God can bring blessing to your life. Blessing can only come from God. Remember what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6, verse 33? But seek first His kingdom and His righteousness. And what did He say? And all these things will be given to you as well. He did not say some of these things or few of these things. He said all. Can you say all? All. Therefore, do not worry about the future. That's what He says here. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow. For tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Do not worry about the future. So here in Matthew chapter 7 to 8, Jesus said, ask. Just like here in the book of Zechariah, God is telling His people, ask. Ask me. And it shall be given to you. Seek, and you shall find. Knock, and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks, receives. The one who seeks, finds. And to the one who knocks, the door will be open. Now, the first part of verse 3, look at what God says here. My anger burns against the shepherds, and I will punish the leaders. So in this verse, God is telling His people to know that He does not tolerate anyone who turns His people away from Himself. Because God has to step in. He is going to deliver His people, and He is going to punish the shepherds, the bad shepherds, who lead His people to sin. Blessing can only come from God. Amen? Amen. Here's the second word. Victory can only come from God. Verses 3 through 5. Not only will God rescue His flock from those who turn them away from Him, but He will also give them victory over their oppressors. Look at the second part of verse 3. For the Lord Almighty will care for His flock, the people of Judah, and make them like a proud horse in battle. Woo! What a transformation. from a powerless flock of sheep to a cavalry of mighty stallions fit for battle. What a transformation. Surely, the poor, harassed people of Judah couldn't have thought such a thing could be possible. Is there anything that is impossible in life? It is God Himself who will do the transforming. Amen?
Amen.
Now, look at verse 4. We'll see another transformation here in verse 5 as well. But let's look at verse 4 first. From Judah will come the cornerstone. From him, the tent peg. From him, the battle bow. And from him, every ruler. Here in verse 4, the Lord promised them that they will be the people from whom the Messiah Himself will come. And we know this. We know already who Jesus is. He is the cornerstone, right? And He is the Messiah. But they don't know that. And God is telling His people here that He's going to send their King, the cornerstone. From Judah comes the cornerstone. You know, this is a picture of the Messiah, a tried and precious foundation stone for His people. You know, at His first coming, they rejected Him. And Paul talks about it, that they rejected the cornerstone. And until now, they still don't want to accept it. That their Messiah already came 2,000 years ago. They cannot accept that. They're still waiting. They're still waiting for their Messiah. Well, yes. They're still waiting. All right. When Jesus comes back, the second time. And look at it. God also says that from Judah would also come the tent peg. What is that? Now, this is not a tent peg that is used to hold down a tent. Okay? But rather, the peg that is pounded into a post into which valuables are hung. You see, in those days, houses didn't really have cupboards or storage closets. They don't have those, or what they call it, aparadores. Closets, where you put your clothes. Okay? They don't have those. Instead, they have pegs, so they can hang their clothes. And they can hang their valuables. Things were stored on pegs, set up all around the room. If something was on its peg, it was safe and secure, stored properly and ready for use at the appropriate time. It is a picture of the Messiah as that one on whom all the greatness of Judah would hang. You see, Jesus was entrusted with all authority in heaven and on earth. He is a valued wealth. Amen? And we will find this illustration of this tent peg in the book of Isaiah. You can read that yourself in chapter 22. He was talking about the flawed of human leaders, that they make poor pegs on which to hang our hopes. They die, and all that's hung on them falls to the ground. But the Messiah will be a reliable peg upon which all will rest securely. So the 10th peg speaks of the Messiah's reliability of leadership. Furthermore, that from Judah will come the battle bow. This is a picture of the Messiah as a mighty conqueror. You know, the world has seen many such conquerors. And Judah was about to see one, the coming of Alexander the Great. Right? And one day, the world would see one that would rise in the person of the Antichrist. He will be a great conqueror too. He's going to be the world leader. Not just one country, but the world leader. But the greatest one, the final one, will be the Lord Jesus Christ. He will come on a white horse. And his name will be what? Faithful and true. And in righteousness, he judges and he makes war. The battle bow speaks of the Messiah's military success of leadership. You will find that in Revelation chapter 19, if you want to know more about it. And also we are told in verse 4 that from Judah will come every ruler. But this is not to be seen as a reference to the Messiah. Okay? Every ruler. Look at that. So the word in Hebrew for ruler is one that means tyrant or dictator. So here, from Judah will come every tyrant or dictator. And we see that every such ruler is here described as coming from Judah. Some interpret this as a promise from God that every oppressor of his people will depart and be driven away from Judah. No earthly Gentile king will rule the people of God, for they will be ruled over by their own king, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And that's our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen? Amen. Now, look at verse 5. Together, they will be like warriors in battle, trampling their enemy into the mud of the streets. They will fight because the Lord is with them. And they will put the enemy horsemen to shame. Wow. Another transformation. Here, in verse 5, it tells us that the Lord will transform them into victorious warriors. And the Lord will not do all the fighting, but He is going to empower His people to conquer like mighty warriors. You know what Paul says about us? That we were made more than conquerors. So we're not just conquerors. We are more than that. How's that sound? How's that sound to you? More than conquerors. We are more than victors. And look at this. His presence will enable them to be victorious. His presence. They will fight because the Lord is with them. You know, we are at war, right? Are we at war? Huh? Or are we in peacetime? Christians, we are at war. what Paul says in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 to 17. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in His mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle, our war, is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armor of God so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you have done everything, to stand. Stand firm then, with the belt of truth buckled around your waist, with the breastplate of righteousness in place, and with your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. In addition to all this, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. You know, Apostle Paul is telling us that we engage in spiritual warfare. But you see, most believers nowadays have a peacetime mentality. They have stopped believing that we are at war. No urgency, no watching, no vigilance, no strategic planning. Just easy peacetime and prosperity. Look at the next slide. Look at the full armor of God. We need to put this on every single day. Amen? You need to put it on. Because we are at war. And of course, we can be sure of our victory. Because victory can only come from God. Amen? Amen. Here's the last thing that can only come from God. Revival. Revival. So let's look at this. There are 5 different themes regarding revival of Israel. Number 1, we can see the promise for the revived Israel, the prosperity for the revived Israel, the providence for the revived Israel, the pathway and the plan for the revived Israel. We're going to look at this one by one. Now, in verse 6, we're going to see the promise for the revived Israel. Look at verse 6. I will strengthen Judah and save the tribes of Joseph. I will restore them because I have compassion on them. They will be as though I had not rejected them. For I am the Lord their God, and I will answer them. So here, what are the promises here that we can see? First of all, the reunion of the north and the south kingdom. You know they were divided, right? After Solomon, the kingdom of Israel were divided into 2, the north and the south. So that's why here we can see, I will strengthen Judah. That's the southern kingdom. And I'm going to save the tribes of Joseph. That is the northern kingdom. And the second thing that was promised here is the restoration. I will restore them. Remember, this book of Zechariah is all about restoration of Israel. Huh? The first 8 chapters of the book of Zechariah has to do with the restoration of the city of Jerusalem and the temple. Remember? All my sermons were all about the rebuilding of the city and the temple. And what was the reason? Compassion. Look, because I have compassion on them. And then here we will see, and they will be as though I have not rejected them. A reversal of rejection. And the last one here is the responsiveness of personal God. For I am the Lord, their God. You see how personal that is? For I am the Lord, their God. And look at this. I will answer them. Now let's look at the prosperity for the revived Israel. Verses 7 and 8. The Ephraimites will become like warriors, and their hearts will be glad as with wine. Their children will see it and be joyful. Their hearts will rejoice in the Lord. I will signal for them and gather them in. Surely I will redeem them. They will be as numerous as before. Now here, in these two verses, we will see that prosperity is characterized by might, Mary, and many. Let's look at the next slide. You see that? First is might. The Ephraimites will become like warriors. Strength, might. The next is Mary. And their hearts will be glad as we want. Their children will see it and be joyful. Their hearts will rejoice in the Lord. Joy, Mary, and then many. Why many? Look, I will signal for them, or I will whistle. That's what it says in Hebrew. It's like, psh, I got to whistle. I did not whistle. But this is what God's going to do. He's going to whistle, okay? And gather them in. You know, the shepherds, that's what they do, right? They have a whistle to call their sheep. So they have a distinct whistle that the sheep can identify, and they will go and will follow that shepherd. Surely I will redeem them. Look at this. They will be as numerous as before. Numerous as before. There are going to be a lot of them. Their population is going to multiply. We will see more of this later. That the Lord is going to multiply His people. Here's another promise. The providence. Another theme. The providence for the revived Israel. Israel eventually will return to the promised land. Look at verse 9. Though I scatter them among the peoples, yet in distant lands they will remember me. They and their children will survive, and they will return. You know, in the 20th century, many Jewish people were gathered back to the land of Israel. And of course, in 1948, Israel became a nation again. After more than 2,000 years of not being a nation, they were scattered all over the world. They just become a nation in 1948. Now, does the 20th century gathering of Israel fulfill this prophecy? Yes, it fulfills it in part, but only in part. Because Israel will be gathered again in belief. Not in rejection of their Messiah, the Lord Jesus Christ. The gathering began in unbelief, but will end up in belief and trust in their Messiah, that they will come back to Israel. And there's a lot of Jewish people now that believe in the Lord Jesus Christ. with supporting one of those Christian Jews. You know that God promised that whoever blesses his people, he will bless you. That's the promise of God. Let me tell you this, when we started giving support to those Jewish people, the income of this church grew. Because the Lord fulfills his promise. Why don't you try that? I tried, and I proved God. He blessed me when I started giving to the Jewish people for their salvation, that they will know their real Messiah. The Lord started to bless me. Look at verse 10. I will bring them back from Egypt and gather them from Assyria. I will bring them to Gilead and Lebanon, and there will not be room enough for them. Wow. So the Jews in the future, I believe, will be taken from two areas and placed into a corresponding two areas. They are taken from Egypt and Assyria, and they will be transferred, some of them at least, not into Israel proper, but rather into Gilead and Lebanon. Where is Gilead? Gilead is east of Jordan River. And Lebanon is north of Israel, just before Syria. So you can see Israel, Lebanon, Syria. Well, why is the Lord not going to just put these folks in Israel proper? You know why? It's because of what he says in his last statement in verse 10. There won't be enough room for all of them in Israel. Why? Because the Lord is going to multiply their number. That there will be no room in Israel for the Jews. The Lord has to put some of them to Gilead and some of them to Lebanon. Why? You see that promise right there? They will be as numerous as before. Now here's another thing, the pathway for the revived Israel. They will pass through the sea of trouble. The surging sea will be subdued, and all the depths of the Nile will dry up. Assyria's pride will be brought down, and Egypt's scepter will pass away. Listen to that. According to John MacArthur in his commentary regarding this passage, he said, similar to Israel crossing the Red Sea, God will remove both geographical and political obstacles to Israel's return for the kingdom of Messiah. Assyria and Egypt, they are traditional enemies of Israel. They symbolize any nation that would try to withstand God from fulfilling his will and purpose for Israel. And here's the last thing. The plan for the revived Israel. I will strengthen them in the Lord, and in his name they will live securely, declares the Lord. So when the people looked upon themselves, few in number, scattered here and there, troubled, distressed, and harassed, they must have wondered how this could possibly happen. But God tells them that he himself will bring this about for them. And nothing is impossible with God. Revival can only come from God. Amen? So since blessing, victory, and revival can only come from God, our call is to trust God's plan, trust his promises, and seek what God has not what the world has to offer. Amen? That's our call. So, keep coming. Keep coming and put your trust in God. Amen? Let's go to God in prayer. As your heads bowed and your eyes closed, the Lord is here. And He is offering Himself to you. Jesus said, ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives. The one who seeks finds. And to the one who knocks, the door will be open. Walk with God. Because with Him comes everything you ever wanted in your life. And much, much more. Heavenly Father, thank you for the time that you have allowed us to learn from your holy word. The time has gone by so fast. We don't even realize because of the joy that we share in knowing your truth. Thank you for these faithful ones that are here today. Father, I am so encouraged that there are folks like them who faithfully, week after week, come to learn from your holy word. And not only to learn, but to be challenged and to be encouraged by your word. Father, it is my prayer that each one of us who heard this message will be faithful to reach out to Israel, to assure them of this wonderful truth, and that they will come to know their Messiah, our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Give us a heart for Israel, and also give us a heart for all those who are not part of your kingdom, because they don't know you. May we take the good news of the Lord Jesus Christ with them in the way we live,